Greetings, Minecrafters, and welcome to another Minecraft discussion. My name is Kimberly Quinn, and I'm here to have a chat, continuing chat for some of you who may be watching the YouTube channel as well. But my whole plan here is to do an ACOA or Adult Children of Alcoholics series, which has been working really well on the YouTube channel. And I wanted to also extend this series to those interested in the Minecraft podcast because though there's some overlap in the audience, they're not exactly the same. Yeah. So right out of the gate, I'd like to do a shout out to Janet Jerringer-Wojcicki and also Claudia Black because they were the two pioneers, at least the ones I listened to anyway, back in the 80s. These two women are just dynamos. And I remember way back when I was at St. Mike's as an undergrad, I was in an adult childhood alcoholics group at the counseling center, and Claudia Black came to speak at St. Mike's actually, and a little tiny powerhouse that she is. And to this day, I just remember how dynamic that was and how it got me going on my healing journey, really, in recovery from, growing up in an addicted household with so much turbulence and shame. And one of the first things that Janet touches on is she has a list here, but that adult children of alcoholics, we often guess at what normal is. I mean, think about what incredible sense that makes because when we grow up in especially as when we're little children, our whole world is, really small. It's our living room basically, mom and dad or dad and dad and whomever, maybe there's a grandparent around. You have a couple of friends that you have to be brought to their houses and picked, it's like very, very small world. And so it's easy to grow up thinking that the loudness is normal, maybe even the violence is normal. I definitely have violence in my house and also this smoothing over of emotions, the blatant not talking about emotions, and we kind of learn from the ground up that this is how the world is because this is how our world is. And also I'll say this: if I have some dual listeners that listen to the listen/watch the YouTube channel, these aren't exactly the same. And also the reason is sometimes I can read little blurbs on this podcast, which I don't do when I'm, videoing out in the woods with little Giovanni. But anyway, I'll just start out with, I'm going to try and keep these a little shorter as well, because Janet kind of right out of the gate talks about, or asks this big question, when is a child not a child? And then she answers with, when the child lives with alcoholism. This is Janet Jerringer-Wojcicki, and she wrote the book, Adult Children of Alcoholics, which has been it was on the bestseller list for a very long time, 3.5 decades ago. And it's still, I guess I would call it an oldie but a goodie. Anyway, she says, when the child grows up with alcoholism, she says, but more correctly, when is a child not childlike? I love that. And she says, you certainly looked like a child and dressed like a child. Other people saw you as a child, unless they got close enough to that edge of sadness in your eyes. God, I can relate to that. Or that worried look on your brow. You behaved much like a child, but you were not really frolicking. You were just sort of going along. Wow, I can just remember that. I can remember just going through the motions of that, and I can remember feeling different and not knowing why I felt different. Of course, I also have the ADHD thing too. But I'm talking specifically about my family system. I remember on some level just getting like, I don't think this is right, but I don't really know because I'm a kid and I don't see a lot of other people really. I mean, you go to school and that's structured and different, but as far as other households and, when you're 7 and 8, you don't have a lot of exposure to other households. And anyway, so just kind of can relate to that feeling. And then she writes, you behave much like a child, but you were not really frolicking, you're just going along. You didn't have the same spontaneity that the other kids had, but no one really noticed that. That is, unless they got very close. And if they did, they probably didn't understand what that meant. And, when Janet talks about the same spontaneity, kids are naturally spontaneous, right? And in one of the other Minecraft episodes I did on the YouTube channel, not related to this actually, but the spontaneity thing is what just tripped my cord right now and led me to a squirrel moment, is that in order to joy is spontaneous. Kids are naturally spontaneous and therefore naturally joyful. And so if you felt as a child you had to be calculated and planned and have control and you weren't as apt to be spontaneous, I mean, logically, that you didn't experience very much of any joy either. And, when I did the other one on Minecraft too, I thought, "Oh, this is just such an important foundation." For some reason, I'm feeling this is even more important as I do the podcast for this is similarly because it's huge to not have had a childhood or to at least not have felt that you had as much of a childhood as other kids. And of course, there's no such thing as a perfect family. However, thankfully, I think, many children are able to be children and be free and kind of frolic around. And though for those of us who grew up in an addicted family, we were surrounded by a lot of intensity, and not all the time, which also can be confusing too. But most of the time, I definitely felt the seriousness in the air. And sometimes the levity wasn't necessarily authentic, which also had little kid radar up because then you don't know how to trust people. But that's a whole other episode that's coming. So Janet talks about that the fact remains that you didn't really feel like a child. And she says you didn't even have the sense of what it's like to have a child's feelings. That is so freaking huge. Because kids, as we know, are naturally, playful and spontaneous, as we were saying, which you can't be if you're worried a lot. You're 6 years old and you're worried about, dad passing out in the recliner and not making the bus, or mom, not doing her thing, or just glazing over, the pink elephant with the purple polka dots on it on the couch, and not, talking about Uncle so and so who's doing inappropriate things, whatever. And she talks about, I like the analogy. She makes an analogy to a puppy. She says, a child is very much like a puppy, offering and receiving love freely and easily, scampering, somewhat mischievous, playful, doing work for approval or a reward, but doing as little as possible. Most important, being carefree. If a child is like a puppy, you were not a child. I mean, so what's really important to realize here is that for those of us who, really did not have a carefree childhood, when you're 6 and 7 and 8 and 10 and 15 or whatever, so concerned for the household and worrying about younger siblings and maybe even caretaking, not just physically, but emotionally, a parent, by the time you get to real adulthood, you're exhausted because you didn't even have that whole carefree time of getting to be a little golden retriever puppy and, doing as little as possible and being distracted by every lovely shiny object around and just playfully chasing it and exploring it and just learning from it and watching it and whatever. And what's really important here is to realize that, people say, oh, kids are resilient. Thankfully, kids are resilient. And that said, these seeds that are planted early do have an impact on us as grown-ups and really need to be worked through in order to fully enjoy, phase 2, 3, 4, 5, or whatever we're going up to with adulthood, because that inner child, that inner 5-year-old who was so worried about mommy or daddy or mommy and mommy, that inner 8-year-old who was caretaking her younger sibling, that inner 9-year-old who was caretaking a mom who passed out, that inner 10-year-old who was worried about their parents' marriage, all of those seeds planted, grew into something. And of course, there's some positives in this with resilience and everything else, but that inner child often gets stuck to a certain degree and or shaped in a way that leads to certain behavioral patterns in adulthood, which what we're going to talk about for the rest of the time. So this is a good start for everybody who's listening. I hope it's working for you, and if you are listening, there's a reason, and give yourself a big huge pat on the back for having the courage to look at this stuff, which might seem really scary to you. And that said, this is informational only. These podcasts not meant to be in the place of any professional treatment. But yeah, you are courageous, and I'm happy and proud of everyone who is listening. Thank you for being here. This is Kimberly Quinn signing off from Northern Vermont. Have a mindful day.